TU alumni, students, faculty, staff, and friends. I'm Jenna Mills, the Director of Alumni Engagement Programs and a proud 2009 and 2016 graduate of Towson University. Thank you for joining us today for the second part of this discussion on civil rights in Maryland. Today's discussion is co-sponsored by the Towson University Retired Faculty Association and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Towson University. I'd like to thank Tracy Miller and Tracy Jacobs for collaborating again with us and making this event possible. Joining me today from the TU Alumni Relations team to help with this presentation is Steve Rosenfeld, Director of Alumni Communication and Recognition. Before I introduce today's guests, I just want to share a few housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded and it will be shared with all event registrations when it is finalized. Please be patient. This process may take a few weeks to add closed captioning. And again, we will share that with you all once it is ready. Today's discussion will be more interactive for our guests. So please share your questions using the chat function in your window as they come up to you. And we will try to build those questions into the discussion. Direct your questions to all panelists. Questions will remain anonymous. I'd now like to introduce our panelists today, C. Fraser Smith and Dr. Donn Worgs. Fraser is a retired columnist and editorial writer for the Baltimore Sun and served as a political analyst for Baltimore's national public radio station, WYPR. He is the recipient of numerous journalism awards and is the author of Here Lies Jim Crow, Civil Rights in Maryland. Dr. Donn Worgs is a TU professor in the Department of Political Science. His areas of study include American politics, urban politics, African American studies and politics, and community development. He has authored numerous articles for publication, as well as papers, reports, and presentations. Donn and Fraser, I'm so excited to be here again with both of you today to talk more about what civil rights movements were like in the past, the parallels with today's movements, and where we really go from here. I know that there's some attendees who are unable to join us for the first discussion. Donn, do you mind giving us a brief overview of what we touched on last month?
Okay, no problem. First of all, thank you for inviting me again. The last time was fun, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion. So in the last discussion, we talked a lot about the civil rights movement in general and the civil rights movement in Maryland specifically. I thought it was pretty interesting. I recall I always emphasize the three underappreciated aspects of the civil rights movement that I always discuss. One is the really just how bad the conditions were before the movement that kind of spawned the movement. The second is the role of women in the movement, and the third being the amount of violence surrounding the movement. We talked about that dynamic in Maryland as well. We also discussed some of the specific important events in Maryland in terms of the civil rights movement. We discussed the attempts to desegregate Gwynn Oak Amusement Park. We talked a good bit about the Cambridge movement and Gloria Richardson, which kind of revealed two of the things I said earlier, the violence around the movement and the role of women leadership. We discussed the student sit-ins in Maryland as well. And then we kind of just really had a general conversation about, the significance and the challenges around civil rights in the U.S. and in Maryland and specifically. So I think that kind of gets at much of what we covered, I believe.
No, it was a great overview. Thank you. And I know we're building this conversation off a little bit of some of the questions that were posed in the last discussion, and we just were unable to get to them. So hopefully we'll be able to answer some of your questions if you asked them last session and we did not get to answer them. We're hoping we can do that again for you today, or at least share the answers or our perspectives today. So to start, we're going to run this session a little bit more like a then and now approach. So again, this is going to be a very interactive session for our listeners and our audience. Please make sure you ask your questions as they come up, use your chat function and pose them to all panelists. But to begin, Donn and Fraser, do you think you could share some of the parallels and differences that you both see between the movements in the 60s and the current civil rights movements?
Well, I can offer a start there. It has occurred to me that something that happened in the 70s or 80s that I think could not happen today, involved the statuary at in Annapolis and also in Baltimore of the judge who decided the Dred Scott case, who was a Marylander, which makes him a part of the Maryland civil rights history. And some years after the decision, which was incredibly important, some people say that it was one of the most important things that led us into a civil war. Roger B. Taney was the judge. His statue, two copies of the statue, one in Baltimore, one in Annapolis. And every so many years, there were movements, legislators would begin these, to remove the Taney statue. And it, as everything else in Annapolis, it became political. And one of the delegates offered a bill that would have had Taney hauled away. And Howard Rawlings, Pete Rawlings, decided that nobody should get ahead of him in an action of this kind. And he was prompted by the then archivist, and I'm blanking on his name, of course, but Pappenfuse, Ed Pappenfuse went to Pete and said, if we start tearing down statues, now this is an issue that we're familiar with from today, but he said, if we start tearing down statues, it'll never end. For example, there's a photograph of Spiro Agnew in the ceremonial room in the State House. Are we going to should we take that down? Some people would say yes, and others no, of course. But Pappenfuse said at the time, let's do this. Let's have a statue of Thurgood Marshall, and there was one, and it's a beautiful, very. If a statue can be charismatic, it is that. It's right on Lawyers Mall when you're walking into the State House, and it's an elegant statement, really, because you have these two justices of the Supreme Court surrounding the lawmaking center of the state of Maryland. But once again, this solution probably would not have worked today. And actually in Baltimore, the then mayor decided that she needed to get rid of all of the civil rights-like statues because of what happened in Charlottesville. So in a sense, the civil rights movement is a little bit more militant and I guess you could say unforgiving. And why should it ever be forgiving? But that's one of the differences between them and then was, only 30 or 40 years ago. But it's much more different today. I think the movement is much more militant than it was, and it's actually bigger than it was, because you have a lot of white people are involved in it. Whether they'll stay in it is another question. But that's a question for both black and white, I think. It's up to everybody now to stay on focused and stay on subject.
It's interesting. I'm thinking about some of the similarities between, the civil rights movement of the 60s into the 70s and, the contemporary movements. We talked before about the issue of police brutality, police violence, and, looking back, that has always been an issue for African Americans, and something they mobilized around and engaged in politics around. I recall that Thurgood Marshall, one of his first cases was around a black man who had been killed in Prince George's County by the police. But in the 60s, other than the riots that erupted in the aftermath of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. I mean, the primary cause of unrest and violent explosions were police killings or police beatings of individuals. And so if you look at the Watts riot, the Harlem riots, the Detroit, Newark, there's cities all around the country were exploding, and the spark for those explosions was typically, some kind of a police action or rumors of a police action. What's different now, though, is well, first of all, the issue is still recurring. I think the explosions in the 60s were much more drastic than what we've seen here in recent years. Right? We see the fires, in cities around the country today, but it's nothing like the fires, that erupted, 50 years ago. The number of the people who were killed in those conflagrations, the amount of damage that occurred was much at a much greater level. But the issues is still kind of the same. So I think that's an interesting parallel. The other parallel that I think is worth reflecting on is peaceful protest, right? So you have like the violent eruptions, but then you have folks saying, well, why don't people just protest in a peaceful way? And that was the case then as now. But what's funny is how people talk about Dr. King today. They say, well, why don't folks try to act more like Dr. King when they have an issue? And he was for love and togetherness, and it's that's true, but Dr. King was not loved universally back then, right? I mean, he's loved a lot more now than he was then. And when he was, leading marches in the early 60s, there were a lot of folks who viewed him as the, outside agitator, as a disruption, as overly militant. And he was not universally appreciated. And so it's funny now to hear folks who talk about him as if he was universally appreciated. And then so I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about the folks kneeling and how controversial that is today, and yet, well, how controversial it was at first, and then in a couple of years and some other events happening, it's become a lot less controversial to the point where some folks are saying, hey, that's the way you should protest as opposed to breaking windows, et cetera, et cetera. So it was it's interesting to see the parallels in terms of how protest is received, then and now, and how that evolves over time.
I wonder if in some places there's a kind of a maturing protest. And Baltimore might actually be an example. I think some of the protests that went on here were pretty calm and pretty peaceful. There wasn't a lot of police action. And I think that's attributable to something that lasted after Freddie Gray. People began to understand that on the one hand, you were venting your emotions and your anger, and on the other hand, you were creating a political barrier to some of the changes that you were trying to achieve. Because I think this is particularly true now. A lot of the demonstrators, their introduction to inequality and injustice was the policeman kneeling on the man's neck until he died. And in a way, this is also an important difference in the kind of protests we have. For the longest period of time, much longer than it should have taken, we needed to change the laws. Mm-hmm. I think that, and we achieved a lot of that. And so some people are wondering, why are we still doing this when we made so much progress? And what was missed in all of that, and Ta-Nehisi Coates writes about this in his two books, about the constant everyday fear there is in the Black community that something like what happened to George could happen to them. And so you have these stories about the speech that has to be made to young black men about how to behave if they get arrested by somebody. And it became much more personal than I think it used to be. The need, I mean, people would stand up and say to themselves, really, is this really the way people in the inner city have had to feel about life? And that needed to be addressed, and it wasn't being addressed, I don't think, until now.
Yeah,
And so that's a big difference, I think, between where we've been and where we are now.
yeah, I think that's an interesting point in terms of the discussion about progress, right? So on one hand, we see laws were changed. We see material conditions of at least a portion of the African American community. And, you know, those conditions have improved for a lot of folks. We see certain sort of, you know, visible notes of progress, whether it's, you know, folks in high level positions, et cetera. But the challenge, I don't even know if everyone fully appreciated the challenge of getting a society, the institutions, and folks working on behalf of institutions to fully value the lives of everybody equally, right? And that's like a much greater challenge than I think folks appreciated. And it's a trickier challenge, right? Because it's like when you think about the police violence, you know, the killing of George Floyd, or of you know, any of these other folks, Breonna Taylor in Louisville. When you think about that, it's like, okay, those officers probably didn't leave their house that day planning to kill somebody in that way, but they engaged in a style of policing and in certain actions that did not prioritize the preservation of the lives of these people, right? And that's sort of entwined with the devaluing of the lives, the devaluing of certain people. Would they have treated other people in the same way, right? Would you, if it occurred to you that, hey, something could go wrong when we kick down this door in the middle of the night, you know, and should we maybe take a different approach to make sure nobody gets hurt? All right. But when you're dealing with maybe certain communities, you don't think about that. That's not really an issue. And that's the whole root of this concept of, you know, Black Lives Mattering, right? Like, does it matter to you whether or not someone lives or dies, right? Does that thought occur? And that's something I think folks really appreciated, that you had to work to impart into the minds and into our institutions. And that's hard, right? That's really difficult, because that's beyond just changing laws. It's how do you really change the way institutions and the people within these institutions behave? And I don't know, that's a tough one. Yeah.
Well, you know, there's an example of that right in our faces that's hard to miss, and that is the impact of the virus in communities of color. Because a lot of people that were on the front lines work in those places, and also a lot of neighborhoods in Baltimore, in particular, the disparities between the state-of-the-art healthcare that exists, the healthcare that we see in the Black community is very different. And I mean, actually, if you wanted to make a case for Black lives don't matter, look at some of the neighborhoods and their health profiles in the city. If you lived in Sandtown, Winchester, where Freddie Gray lived, you might your life expectancy would be 10 to 20 years, literally, fewer than if you lived in Charles Village, which is maybe 2 or 3 miles distant. And there's no real organized effort to address it. The city health department has pointed it out over and over again. And Lena Wen was working on it, and she made some incremental improvements in that. But the numbers are still there. And what it suggests to me is that the civil rights movement in the future is going to have to be focused on things like that. Somebody raised the question of, you know, the relationship between the civil rights we think of before we think of this and the health disparities. There's a completely direct relationship.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Just the range of disparities, you know, health being, you know, probably at the top of the list, economic disparities, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at those, the numbers, if you look at the statistics, if you look at just people's lives, it's like, it's overwhelming, right? And then, but I guess, but what gets the attention, of course, are these sort of these events that spark these eruptions, but those eruptions are occurring within this broader context of a wide array of challenges that folks are facing. I mean, that was a discussion in the 1960s as well as a discussion today, right? So in the 60s, it was like, you know, what's causing all this? And then you get all these reports that say, you know, look at all these different ways that African Americans are, you know, sort of having this disparate experience. And today, you know, the focus is on, you know, police, you know, and community interactions. But, you know, that's one element in this broader array of you know, just disparities. And it's almost like, I guess one thing I appreciate about this moment is raising the calls for, you know, racial justice in these conversations. Maybe things will become visible, right? That people can see and then appreciate and then prioritize trying to figure out ways to address these things. But it's difficult, right? It's difficult to do in a context where, you know, there are limited resources and folks have limited attention, and many folks say, hey, I've got my own problems. I don't, you know, I'm not doing anything to these other folks. Why do I have to think about this and worry about it? And so it's really complicated. It's a complicated moment. So I guess that the task would be to make as much progress as possible while there's the attention of the world on these issues, and then hope that, you know, that can be sustained for as long as we can.
That really is where we are, I think. There is potentially a much broader appreciation of the need to strive for justice. As you say, it's really complicated. And another good current example, I think, is when there was a lot of, even more perhaps, I don't remember the precise figures, but a lot of crime in the streets, quote unquote, and some of it was coming from drug neighborhoods. And people in the Black community were saying, they were saying what people in the suburbs would be saying: I can't live with this. It needs to be dealt with. And a lot of the attention it drew from people like Martin O'Malley, the mayor, and then the governor, was zero tolerance. Mm-hmm. Again, I'm addressing what you said about the complexity of dealing with these things. You know, suddenly you're clearing the streets and the stoops, arresting lots of people. I think they ended up arresting 100,000 people, and so they all had a criminal record after that. So in the long run, what happened there? I know that there were people who said to Martin, "Don't do that. You know, figure out something else." But you can understand why he would want to. I mean, I think the ministers actually were part of the coalition that urged him to take the action that they did. So it's probably one complicated thing after another, but that's no excuse for standing down and not proceeding with the advantages that we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And Fraser, that does bring up a question that was raised in the last session when you talk about ministers, but can you both talk about what the role of the church and religious leaders were like during the civil movement then and now?
Okay. Well, in my book, I talk about the Goon Squad, which was 7 or 8 mostly mostly ministers who realized that their parishioners were in the street and that's where they needed to be. So they, instead of just talking about the hereafter, they needed to start talking about the now. And so during the riots, for example, a lot of the members of the Goon Squad, and these were all, they were accused of being just a bunch of goons. They adopted that name as a badge of honor. Yeah, we're goons and we're doing what needs to be done here. I think, I'm not sure that same group of people still exists. Donn, you may be able to address that more directly in a more informed way than I can.
Yeah, I don't know if those specific folks or the same kind of labeling or group exists, but I do know that, that there are, in the contemporary movements, that there are a number of ministers and churches that have been involved and at the center of some of the organizing and at the center of some of the reactions to the events, especially in and around the Freddie Gray incident. I recall, there were a number of meetings held in the churches, community meetings, led by some of the local religious leaders who were kind of trying to galvanize the sentiment and organize folks to make formal protests against what they thought was an injustice. And then, of course, even if you follow the chronology of those events, then the funeral of Freddie Gray, which was, of course, a religious ceremony, was actually also a site of kind of resistance and protest to what had happened to him. And it was in the aftermath of the funeral, a different set of folks who weren't at the funeral who kind of end up getting into the confrontation with the police, and then sort of sparking, the unrest that would occur. One of the fascinating stories, of course, that came out of that event was that, during the midst of this uprising at its height, that there was a call for ministers to return to the church where they had the funeral for Freddie Gray, and then those ministers, gathered together and then went out into the streets to try to quell some of the unrest. I've spoken to a number of folks who were part of that. And one of the interesting things, someone was telling me how, walking down the streets and the tear gas is all around, and they're seeing the police with their riot uniforms on. And one minister was telling me, it was like he said he was afraid because he had recently seen the movie Selma and he had these images of the police beating folks, but when they got to the police, they kneeled and prayed, and then the police officer said, hey, can you work with us and help us? We need to get a fire engine down the block. Can you help clear the way, and kind of be a buffer to help this fire engine get down and put out a fire? And then some of them did that. And so it was, and they talk about this as being sort of a transformative experience. And so the interesting thing was, for some of the ministers, they'd always been active in social issues. Others hadn't been. And this was kind of a moment that brought them to see, we've got to be in the streets and we can be effective and be impactful in terms of shaping what comes next. So it's really interesting. There's a variety of ways that the churches are playing a role in communities and these contemporary movements. One other thing I'll add on that, because this is something I've looked at, is this whole Black Lives Matter movement and some of the activists that identify with Black Lives Matter. It's a little different from in the civil rights movement, right? In the civil rights movement, at least, the early stages of it came out of the church. The church leaders were at the center of it. The church dynamic, even if you look at the way people dressed for protest, they wore their church clothes. It was the whole kind of, the whole way that people approach these events. But this contemporary movement isn't really coming out of the churches in the same way, and some of the activists in the streets are a little suspicious of the church leaders. So there's like an internal dynamic that has to be kind of worked out because there are these religious leaders who want to participate, but then there are folks on the streets who are kind of skeptical of them, and there's some they have some different disagreements around certain issues. So that's sort of an internal challenge that's interesting to see unfold. What was that?
It's all complicated.
Yeah.
I mean, look at how much change has happened in the involvement of, or the election of Black leaders.
Mm-hmm.
They're the ones that now often are dealing with the financial implications of change. I mean, the kinds of problems that are, if you were to decide that there should be a sort of a health Marshall Plan,
mm-hmm.
you couldn't stop at Sandtown, Winchester.
Mm-hmm.
Probably every Black neighborhood in Baltimore has the same profile. But we're not at the moment organizing what's available to us in terms of health resources, which is really quite a commentary for our city, because we have both Johns Hopkins Hospital and the University of Maryland Hospital and a big veterans hospital. Let's do an inventory of what they're doing. I'm sure they're doing something, but are they addressing these issues in the same way they would in Charles Village or somewhere else in the state of Maryland? I don't know. Those kinds of examinations of budgets, for example, mm-hmm. need to happen. And this is where everybody gets involved, because your vote matters. Yeah. And so again, I guess I'm just trying to amplify about the complexity we now face.
Yeah. It's funny you said that about the elected officials. I mean, I don't know if this would make us hopeful that it's so complex or less hopeful. I mean, but it's a major challenge. I was just thinking about Rochester, right? Or so many of the other cities where things have happened. They may have Black elected leadership, right? In Rochester, you had a Black mayor and a Black police chief, and the Black police chief is the one who's gotten fired because of the police, in response to the killing of the gentleman up there, who was having the mental health crisis, and ultimately died from the I guess asphyxiation that occurred when the police came in to supposedly help him, right? And so it makes the discussion real complicated. It's not as simple as there are a group of racists who are doing racist things to Black people. It's not that simple, right? It's really about institutions and how do institutions engage and interact with folks on the margins. And that's a complicated task to restructure and reform organizations to act differently. Oftentimes, the police officer, the actual police officers who engage in some of the violence that people find objectionable are themselves African American or other folks of color. So it's not as, a lot of times it's not, but sometimes it is, and that makes the conversation more complicated than just, hey, there was a couple of racists doing some bad things. So I guess maybe we can shift and get some questions, Jenna.
Yes. So we have had some come through, and I think this one, you can both give your perspective on it, but the statement is basically, what was the unity like, the greater unity like in the Black community then, and where is it now? And also with leadership. I know you've mentioned Dr. King. Do we have another leader in the Black community that's leading in the same direction he did, or is there a leader that's come out of this whole movement that we're experiencing now?
Well, we've had the sad pleasure of recalling John Lewis, and nobody was more a symbol of nonviolent protest than he was. And once again, I think what we saw then was probably had a lot of impact among younger people who may or may not have known what the struggle entailed in those days. But all of it is up against the the militarization of the police and the question of whether the police should be, quote, defunded, which is a horribly imprecise word for what I think most people are thinking about when they say that. But they're one of the jobs, I think, of whatever the new movement is, will be to figure out how to clearly explain what the objectives are.
Yeah, that's interesting. The one of the things about the civil rights movement, and thinking about the question in terms of the unity and the leadership side of it, on one hand, I think we might overstate the level of unity in historically, in the sense that everybody wasn't out there together protesting on this with the same strategy all the time, right? So we talk about churches, you know, the civil rights movement was centered in the churches, and churches were central to the movement, but most churches didn't participate, right? The vast majority of churches weren't participating. Many ministers were like, hey, don't go out in the streets. That's not appropriate for a Christian. So I think we might overstate that the level of unity and the level to which folks agreed on strategies back then. The other thing is this idea of a leader. I mean, there was contentiousness in the civil rights movement as to whether or not there should be one or two premier leaders, charismatic leaders, you know, at the forefront of the movement. One of one of the most fascinating people in the civil rights movement was Ella Baker. She, you know, if you talk to, you know, any of the folks who came out of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, she was like their hero, their teacher, their guiding light. And Ella Baker, whose philosophy was, she was very skeptical of charismatic leaders. She worked with Dr. King, she liked Dr. King, but she didn't agree with the notion of there being a charismatic leader at the head of the movement. And so there was a whole wave of activists who came up kind of following her model and agreeing with her strategies. And the interesting thing is, if you look at some of the folks organizing in Black Lives Matter organizations around the country, they all know about Ella Baker. And in fact, they may mention her, they may use some of her rhetoric, and they are consciously choosing to push forward a movement that has no specific leader, right? Sort of this kind of leaderless movement, this grassroots leadership, right? A group-centered leadership. And there's a real rejection of, a skepticism towards individual charismatic leaders that might emerge, or individual leaders that might emerge. That said, that there is a place for that in terms of maybe of there being a central leader. But you know, there are a lot of folks who resist it. There may be a place in terms of motivating people, serving as a symbol, being kind of a guide that folks can follow. I mean, there may be a role for that, but the contemporary movement kind of doesn't. There are a lot of folks who are consciously against that. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I think there was a point when Gloria Richardson and the people that were in her organization thought about having Dr. King come, and they were not of a single mind about that. One thing, I think they were told that they would have to come up with a lot of money because he was trying to sustain his organization. And, you know, they didn't have any money for that. And they just kind of pivoted out of that idea to thinking about it in the way that you just mentioned. You know, we're the leaders, you know, we have to be led by us. And even Gloria wasn't there for the long run. I think she was there for maybe a year. And then she moved to New York, and I'm not sure she remained in any movement at all, but she was in contact with people down there. And for example, she knew what was going to happen when Rap Brown came down and had, you know, stood on the hood of a car and said, if this town don't come around, then burn it down. She predicted that, and there was some effort to they at least knew what they were in for when he came, and and she was in some conversation or communication with the guard. She was letting them know what they were in for, and it didn't forestall the kind of really bad outcomes that happened often. There were a lot of fires, and typically they were in black neighborhoods, and some businesses that had somehow been able to be prosperous were burned along with everything else. Mm-hmm. So again, fits and starts. You tried one thing, and you if it didn't work, and you tried something else.
That's interesting. Your point about the leaders, not having a leader or identifiable leaders make it difficult for negotiations to occur, right? So part of the strategy is you protest to force, the institutional leadership, the political leadership to negotiate and make changes and implement change policies. But if there isn't a clear set of leaders or particular person that's leading the movement, then that becomes a little harder to occur. It's not impossible, but it's just a bit more difficult to kind of identify who can you kind of work with to try to actually then decide on what changes would satisfy or suffice to calm people down. And so that's, I think, an ongoing challenge of the leaderless model. So, but to be fair, it doesn't say that there are no leaders, but it's just that not the one charismatic leader. That it's maybe the group should be more represented at the table. So that's something we see now. That conscious rejection of one or two primary folks, and it's kind of a democratic vision for why folks say that and promote that.
Thank you, Donn and Fraser. This next question that I'm going to pose is something that actually emerged from our last discussion, and we just didn't have time to get to it. So I'd like to bring it up now. And this is another then and now comparison, but how has there been a change between fairness to minorities in the court system from the first round of civil rights in the 60s and to now?
That's a tough one. I don't know. I mean, that's a really tough one. I mean, I imagine that by some measures there have been. I mean, if you look at the composition of juries in most places, for example, theoretically, folks can get a more a jury that looks more like them than maybe in the past. But we also know that since the 60s to the present, there's been an explosion in terms of incarceration, right? Mass incarceration. I mean, the rate and the numbers of which people the numbers of people who are incarcerated. I mean, we're now, the incarceration nation, as one person described it. So that's a tough one. I mean, I think it's more I don't know that someone can say, hey, our criminal justice system has on the whole now treats Black people better than it did 50 years ago if we look at just the numbers of folks who are caught up in it. So that would be tough to say. I don't know if one can say that if there are more people being caught up in it. However, there's it's just different. I mean, the discourse is different, and I think the challenges become more difficult to see, given that what the mechanisms by which this unfolds is different. Whereas 50 years ago, it's pretty clear, race is at the forefront of everyone's thoughts, and maybe even the rhetoric is clear and direct. Today, the rhetoric is not clear and direct, and it may be more difficult to see why we have these extraordinary disparities in the criminal justice system and in the interactions between police and communities. So yeah, that's a tough one.
I think it's tough too, but I also think it's something that various people have started to address. And of course, there was an entire book about it. Um, about the color was in the title somehow.
The new Jim Crow.
Yeah, and orange is the new black or what.
Yeah.
When I think one of the changes, not a good one, was the concern and fear about cocaine and the decision to impose various penalties on judges that they had no authority to contravene. I mean, they had to exercise what the law said about X offense equals how many years in jail. And what that ended up doing was, I think it was literally crippling to a lot of Black communities. For example, again, Freddie Gray's neighborhood probably had more ex-offenders in it. And I don't think probably, I think it did.
Yeah.
Any other sort of measurable part of the state of Maryland. What did you, so you had, it's heroic and wonderful that women and grandmothers and mothers raised kids. Nobody's arguing against that, but when you didn't have men in the community, you were losing an important element of what a community is or should be. Not to speak of the fact that a lot of, if not all, of people who were sometimes convicted of a minor crime were not able to vote. So if you can't vote, can you expect that a lot of political figures are going to want to come to your neighborhood and look for you? I mean, it just was crippling in so many ways. And I would think that addressing that problem would be pretty high on the list of whatever the new civil rights movement should be.
Yeah, the criminal justice reform is, I mean, there are a lot of folks who are talking about it now. It actually, across the political spectrum, there are a lot of folks talking about, the need to, reduce, the levels of incarceration, to come up with different laws and different approaches for dealing with, the challenges. I think that, well, we see it, for example, and a lot of folks have been talking about the different ways we deal with, substance abuse issues today, or at least we're beginning to deal with it today versus 30 years ago, right? If someone has a problem, quote unquote, a substance abuse problem with crack, they're a criminal, you lock them up. But now when we're dealing with the opioid epidemic, we're thinking about it in different ways as a disease. And then you wonder, well, if we thought about, the crack epidemic in the same way, how might that have changed our strategies? How might that have diverted us from the approach of mass incarceration and the subsequent destabilization that came with that? And that of course is shaped in part by our understanding and our appreciation and the way we value the lives of the people who have these issues, or the lives of the people we perceive as having these issues. And so that it's all entwined in terms of how we see and value each other. And then there's the mass incarceration thing is so tricky because folks supported those laws, right? Black communities, a lot of those folks supported these laws because they wanted to feel safe. And so it wasn't like some O'Malley coming in and saying, hey, we're gonna do the zero tolerance against the will of a lot of folks. There were a lot of folks who supported it because they wanted to feel safe. They thought maybe this is the way for us to feel safe. But then we see how it actually unfolds in trying to implement this policy through institutions that are suffering from generations of devaluing Black lives. Then it becomes it's almost like it's doomed to fail in terms of actually bringing about the outcome that people wanted. And then we also see other strategies work more effectively. We see that community policing strategies in a lot of different places work more effectively in terms of reducing crime. building relationships between police and the communities, giving people a sense of security. We see that there are actually strategies that respect the lives and humanity of communities that are more effective at making those communities safe. We see that there's strategies for dealing with offenders that actually have more of a transformative impact on their behavior. And we see that there's strategies that treat ex-offenders in ways that they are able to rebuild their lives and have prosperous, productive lives that more effectively than, say, the strategies that say once you've got a felony, you can't do anything, right? I have a colleague who writes about this, and she says being an ex-offender is like having a social disability because there are limitations on where you can live. You can't get a job, you can't live in most places. You don't have access to support for your education, and so there are all these things. It's like when you constrain someone in that way, well, what do you expect to happen? What do you expect? How do you expect them to live and thrive? What avenues do they have to be productive? If you want them to be productive, and if you want your communities to be safe.
So Fraser and Donn, where do we go from here? It sounds like we might have a better sense of what's wrong, but do we know how to move forward? What do we do now?
Fraser, any ideas?
Well, I think it's going to have to be cells. I think there's going to have to be local organizations that organize themselves around things like defunding police. And I think that that's an area of a great possibility, because I think often police are asked to do things that they are not equipped to do. And I would think that in some areas, in some enlightened policing areas, and I think we probably could identify them. I don't know their names now, but I'm sure they exist, who would say that defunding, and I need to stop using the word, but changing the mission or finding ways to deal with mental health issues that police are not equipped to deal with. These things often spin out of control, and police end up involved in things that they otherwise wouldn't be involved in. And so, I mean, we're given to believe that police unions are in the way of things like that. But I also think that some of the people who have these ideas need to step forward, and we need to build some movement that can work beyond going into the street, because unfortunately, or fortunately, or whatever, not fortunately, but you end up at cross purposes with yourself. You're not really, you're actually reducing the likelihood that there will be any thoughtful addressing of these issues. I just don't understand why Portland and except for the fact that people have been told that our institutions will solve these problems, but they haven't done it. So you find people staying in the street much longer than they should, particularly if you want some effective action. And once again, Donn, we get to the point of saying it's really complicated.
Yeah. I mean, that's I think it's important to always remember that it's complicated, because in our political discourses, we often end up with simplistic solutions and simplistic ideas that can't possibly work because they don't recognize the array of challenges and the complexity of issues that are intertwined. I think, but if we're talking about progress in these areas, I think that progress for me would have to start with, I'm usually not big on conversation, but at least a clarification of what the priorities are, right? So we have to clarify, what are our priorities? What are the priorities of policing, right? What are the priorities of, our educational system, our healthcare system? And once we're clear about what the priorities are, and that those priorities entail a level of equity and justice, then we can put in place policies and procedures that support those priorities. So, for example, when I talk about like policing and some of the one of the most disturbing scenes I remember seeing some years ago it was a police officer in a school who had dragged a girl across the room because she refused to leave the classroom, right? And I just remember thinking to myself, that to me, the girl, she wasn't like physically harming anyone, but she wouldn't listen to the teacher, and so the police officer literally drags her across the room, and it's just this violent moment. And I remember thinking, if the police officer had been instructed that your priority is the health and well-being of every student in the building, then there's no way that you ever drag a girl across the classroom floor, because that's not going to preserve her health and well-being, right? Whatever your solution is, if you remember your priority is the health and well-being of the students or the health and well-being of the folks in the community, then you're going to do things in a different way, right? It's one thing if you see danger and someone's got a weapon and but if there's no one being hurt, then then that kind of action doesn't make sense. And that, to me, if we start with what our priorities are supposed to be and then try to craft policies and procedures that support those priorities, I think we could make progress in a lot of different areas. I think in policing especially, if we think about what are our priorities, safe and secure neighborhoods. Okay, well, how do we do that? I think that the notion of defund the police is an interesting one because it catches people's attention. But I think we're really talking about, coming up with new ways of conceiving how to provide public safety. How do we ensure the safety of the public? It might be having armed officers respond to certain kinds of incidents, but it might also be having maybe unarmed folks responding to certain kinds of incidents. It might be having, just a different conception of how we deal with different challenges to public safety. And so that's kind of maybe a bigger conversation, but it's not so difficult if we just keep at the forefront what are our priorities, and then we look for examples of policies that have worked that support what we want to prioritize. I think that to me is the pathway to progress, but there's got to be political will, and there's got to be and then you have to have resources to do it.
Thank you. So I just want to remind our participants that we are getting close to our time here. We do have a few more questions, but I just want to make sure that if you do have questions, you just write them into the chat window, and we will try to incorporate them into the last few moments we have together. Donn and Fraser, I know when we talked a little bit about some progress that you have both seen. And Donn specifically, I know you mentioned the increase of self-esteem and racial pride. Do you mind touching on a little bit of what you've noticed in the communities?
In terms of progress, I think that I'll say this. I think that there's progress in the current moment. I'll expand that. I think there's progress in terms of folks of us at least having a moment to collectively say, you know what, these are the things that we agree with, and we actually we agree with notions of racial equity and racial justice, and we agree that that's something that people should be striving for. I think there's progress in at least just making that statement, and then trying to figure out how to make it real. I think this current moment has brought those issues back to the forefront and made it kind of at least necessary for people to think about. And I guess that's useful because it's making some things visible that may have been invisible in recent years.
I agree with that. And I think a lot of the writing that we have seen recently has helped in that regard. I think a lot of people, and I would include myself in this, really did hang a lot of my thinking on the old goals of the civil rights movement, which I think were actually sort of miracles that we can attribute to the democracy that we had. And we need to make sure that somehow we can help to rebuild the trust that somehow has escaped us in many areas of our society and of our government. And I think I heard this from some political leaders some years ago. You know, the problem with our democracy is that too few people get involved. Too few people are willing to take the risk of actually running for office or being involved in some other way. Why we would be suddenly reverting to this kind of pioneering view of individualism when what we need is community, and which we had at one point. I think we need not to give up on those things and be involved. If there are institutions that you care about, and if you care about justice, and I think the demonstrations we see and have seen recently indicate that people do, we need to figure out ways to capture that enthusiasm and expand it and move forward on that at that level with the leadership of Dr. King and John Lewis and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and other people, without whom we wouldn't have some of the advances, or other people would have done it, or maybe not. And if you want to do something, if you want to be, as Obama said, be the change you want to see. I mean, I think that's really very important. And if we don't do that, then we can just look at ourselves as the reason.
Well said.
All right. Well, Donn and Fraser, I really appreciate the conversation today. It seems as though we don't have any other questions coming through. We have a more quieter audience this time around, but I'd like to think that's because you've answered so many people's questions right off the bat. So I just want to thank you both today for joining us. I hope everyone really enjoyed this session today.
Thank you for having me.
You are very welcome. We hope you all can join us for some of our other upcoming events. We'll be celebrating Stay Homecoming Week, October 12th through the 18th. Again, that's Stay Homecoming Week. You heard that correctly. Towson will be hosting a virtual homecoming this year, and that's October 12th through the 18th. And we'll be hosting a variety of virtual activities and events that will include trivia, a cooking class, beer tasting, a 5K, and a virtual tailgate party. On October 14th, during this Stay Homecoming Week, TU Archives Associate Felicity Knox will be sharing the history of TU homecoming. And later in October, we will be teaming up again with our friends in TURFA and OSHR to host a webinar on solving the mystery of the Holy Shroud with Dr. Gary Viken. You can register and learn more about these events at alumni.towson.edu/events. I'd like to thank the TU Retired Faculty Association and OSHR Lifelong Learning Institute for their support of these discussions. And make sure you follow the TU Alumni Association on our social media channels and on Tiger Connect, our alumni community. These details are now in your window. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time.